Aegon the Dragon and his sisters conquered the Seven Kingdoms, 6 of them at least, but it was Jaehaerys the Conciliator who made them one, the writings of Maester Umbert, Fire and Blood, Prince to King. Jaehaerys the Conciliator undeniably deserves his reputation as arguably the best king Westeros ever saw. During his long reign, he fundamentally reformed the whole of Westeros. Outdated and barbaric laws were changed, cities and roads redeveloped. The lives of everyday small folk were seemingly elevated. While there were wars during his 55-year reign, they were few, smaller, and more quickly dealt with, for the most part. Thus, relative to the rest of Westerosi history, even under House Targaryen, it was a relatively peaceful time. It was also helped that he was surrounded by strong and competent advisors, such as Septa Maegelle, Grand Maester Vaegorn, and maybe even the likes of Rhaegar Baratheon. And then of course, there was his sister and wife, Queen Alyssa, who definitely earned her title, the Good Queen, who advocated strongly for the rights of women and the betterment of the small folk, with Alyssa being the key figure behind the outlawing of the right of the First Night. Having such a strong group of advisors certainly helped Jaehaerys achieve his legacy. There is also the context of when he was king, coming in between the brutal reign of Maegor the Cruel, with his successor King Viserra I, arguably instrumental in allowing the civil war between his two children, Rhaenyra and Aegon, to come to fruition via his inaction and inability to see the harsh truth of the matter. Being between two such kings makes Jaehaerys and his reign seem like a golden age in comparison. But there are some who would argue that this is only one side of Jaehaerys, with more of his negative aspects being overlooked. Many readers feel, despite all the good he did as king, he was in fact a terrible father. Many of his children had grim fates, with several of them dying, some of them young, some of them horrifically, which in turn contributes to the circumstances that allowed for the likes of the Dance of the Dragons to even happen. So was Jaehaerys that bad of a father? Yes and no. The answer is much more complicated than the question first makes it seem. He was 69 at his death, and had ruled wisely and well for 55 years. Westeros mourned, and it was claimed that even in dawn men wept and women tore their garments in lament for the king who had been so just and good. His ashes were interred with that of his beloved, the good Queen Alyssa, beneath the Red Keep, and the realm never saw their like again. The writings of Yandel, the world of Ice and Fire, the Targaryen kings, Jaehaerys I. Jaehaerys and Alyssa had a total of 13 children. However, it is fair to point out at this stage that 4 of them died as babies or very young children. Given the setting of Westeros and it having a high infant mortality rate similar to real-world medieval history, the fact 4 died so young is not entirely surprising, or really the fault of anyone. So, out of that remaining 9, as we shall soon discover, many had awful fates, with arguably Jaehaerys bearing some responsibility in them. So when you're looking objectively at the narrative posed in Fire and Blood, was Jaehaerys Targaryen bad, or even in some cases a neglectful father? Or was this all just par for the course, given the setting of Westeros? Jaehaerys' first child was a son named Aegon, who was born in the year 51 AC. The prince was born far too early, and died 3 days later. It is believed Jaehaerys and Alyssa named him after their grandfather Aegon the Conqueror and their lost elder brother, Aegon the Uncrowned. The death of Aegon is really no one's fault, certainly not Jaehaerys', and really was just a tragic loss. However, Alyssa did blame her son's early birth and subsequent death on the woman who had attacked her at Jonquil's pool in Maidenpool while on a royal progress, believing that if she had been allowed to bathe in the pool and its healing waters, Aegon would have lived. While the idea of the healing waters is questionable, it is possible the attack on Alyssa could have impacted the babe in some way. However, as told in Fire and Blood, it's not really clear how much impact the events at the pool really could have had on her pregnancy, but it wouldn't be surprising if it did. The Shivers struck Westeros in 59 AC, during the first year of an especially cruel winter plagued by widespread famine. The writings of Yandel, the world of Ice and Fire, the Targaryen kings, Jaehaerys I. Jaehaerys Targaryen's second child, a daughter, was born in 53 AC. Unlike Aegon, she didn't die as a baby. They named the girl Daenerys, who was born perfectly healthy, but would still die as a child when in 60 AC at the age of 6, the deadly illness known as the Shivers struck Westeros. The small folk were mostly affected, with it causing riots in King's Landing, while the lords and the rich generally were not as badly effective. There was a belief that because House Targaryen were of Valyrian descent and different from normal men, that such illnesses could not harm them. Thus it was a shock to many, including Jaehaerys himself, when Princess Daenerys contracted the illness and died a short few days later. While the death of Daenerys was certainly tragic, given again the medieval society Westeros is, this mimics real-world history. While the rich and nobility were less likely to catch these kind of illnesses due to less a chance of exposure, it did still happen. Some fans argue that it was Jaehaerys' belief in the doctrine of exemptionalism, the idea Targaryens were more than mortal men, perhaps gave him a sense of safety and confidence in their Valyrian genetics protecting them, that perhaps more steps could have been taken to protect the royal children. But there's nothing in Fire and Blood to really indicate this, and I don't think Daenerys' death is a reflection on Jaehaerys as a father in any way. If anything, his desperate actions to try and save his daughter show the reader just how much he did love her. Now this is where it starts to get complicated and a little less obvious, and presents a situation where perhaps some stronger parenting could have perhaps changed the fates of Jaehaerys' children. Thrilled by the news of Prince Aemon's birth, thousands of small folk lined the streets outside the Red Keep when Jaehaerys and Alyssa returned to King's Landing and Moon's Turn later, in hopes of getting a glimpse of the new heir to the Iron Throne, the writings of Archmaester Vaegorn, Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alyssa. Jaehaerys' second son and eldest living son, and presumed heir for much of his reign, was Prince Aemon Targaryen, born in 55 AC, 2 years after Daenerys. Given the Targaryen custom of sibling marriage, for a long time it was assumed Aemon would marry Daenerys. However, her death in 60 AC obviously changed that plan. Aemon, for the most part, was all you could want in a Prince of Dragonstone, as well as being a very accomplished warrior and dragon rider. During the latter half of Jaehaerys' reign, more and more responsibility was given to Aemon to prepare him for his own rule. But to the shock of all, most of all his family, Prince Aemon died at the age of 37 on Tarth, leaving behind his grieving wife, Lady Jocelyn Baratheon, technically also his aunt, and their teenage daughter, Princess Rhaenys, a figure we shall come back to later. Aemon's death was very sudden. He was on Tarth helping Lord Cameron Tarth defeat some Myrish pirates who had captured a significant part of the island. One day, 2 scouts, whom followed the smoke from Aemon's dragon Caraxes' dragonfire at their camp, and stumbled upon Cameron Tarth and Aemon and their army planning their next move. From his vantage point in the hills around the campsite, the scouts spotted Lord Tarth and Aemon talking, with the prince's dragon Caraxes resting nearby. The way it's described in Fire and Blood is the scouts took aim at Lord Tarth with his crossbow, but because of the distance missed his shot, striking Aemon in the throat and killing him. While this is a likely series of events, it's my view we can never really know who the target of the crossbowmen really were. It could have been Aemon rather than Lord Tarth. In fact, it would have made more sense for them to take out Aemon, given he is there with his dragon Caraxes, who would easily destroy the Myrish fleet. Some fans have suggested that Aemon's death does present a character flaw in him that could have perhaps been as a result as to how Jaehaerys had raised his son. Aemon was in an active war zone on a very small island. The enemy were never going to be that far away. He was openly walking about in the open when he was struck by the crossbow bolt. The smoke the Myrish scouts followed was of course caused by Caraxes whilst he was feeding at camp. Doing this gave away their position. What some fans argue is that this displays a sense of overconfidence in Aemon, with perhaps his dragon making him feel too safe. In essence, he didn't give the threat of the enemy presented any respect. The fans who make this argument lay the blame on Jaehaerys and Alyssa for not installing a better ethic in Aemon. However, I personally feel this is a bit of a stretch. Should Aemon have been more careful in a war zone? Yes. Should he have approached the situation with more caution? Certainly. Did he fall into the trap of a security a dragon provides? Definitely. But ultimately, given Targaryen history and his heritage, it's not hard to see why he might feel a sense of invincibility. But at the end of the day, the death of Aemon, if Lord Tarth was indeed the target, was a freak accident. I think the reason the death of Aemon gets so overanalyzed like this is down to the sheer impact it has on the history of Westeros, with it arguably creating a chain of events that leads to the Dance of the Dragons. They call me Baelon the Brave, but you are far braver than me. I would sooner fight a dozen battles than do what you've just done. Baelon to Alyssa after the birth of their son Aegon. Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alyssa. Jaehaerys' third son was Prince Baelon Targaryen, who was born in 57 AC. Baelon as a child was very close to his elder brother Aemon and admired him greatly. Whatever Aemon did, Baelon would follow in his footsteps. In time, this drive to be like his brother developed Baelon into a fierce warrior, knight, and later dragon rider, when he claimed the dragon Vhagar, the fiercest and most powerful of the Targaryen dragons, after Balerion the Blackdread's decline and injuries in 56 AC. Jaehaerys also had another daughter, in Alyssa Targaryen, born in 60 AC. Alyssa took after her brother Baelon. According to Archmaester Vaegorn, she had a warrior's heart. As a child, she did not act like a girl, and shunned the company of other girls her own age. She would dress in boys' clothes whenever possible, and preferred to ride, climb and duel with wooden swords, instead of more ladylike activities, such as sewing and reading and singing. As children, Baelon and Alyssa were inseparable. After the death of Daenerys, it seems it was initially Jaehaerys' intent to marry his heir, Aemon, to Alyssa. However, Queen Alyssa made it very clear to Jaehaerys that Baelon and Alyssa were deeply bonded, and told her husband that Alyssa was meant for Baelon, to which the king agreed. While it was Queen Alyssa who pointed out this to Jaehaerys, the fact that he took his wife's advice and broke the political norm and Targaryen tradition, prioritizing what was best of his children's well-being instead. Some argue that this indicates Jaehaerys could have been an absent father, given he didn't spot this bond between his children himself, which I guess is a fair suggestion. However, I do believe there's really not enough context or information in Fire and Blood to really point that way definitively. What is interesting about this bit of matchmaking is it does directly contradict a similar situation later in Jaehaerys' reign involving finding a husband for another daughter, Daella Targaryen, perhaps highlighting how Jaehaerys' parenting style had changed as he grew older, with the more children he and Alyssa would have. Now, the fates of both Baelon and Alyssa really have nothing to do with Jaehaerys or his supposed bad parenting. Alyssa would die very young in 84 AC at only the age of 24 due to complications during childbirth of her and Baelon's third son, they named Aegon, who also died shortly after his mother. When Aemon died in 92 AC, Jaehaerys named Baelon his heir and Prince of Dragonstone, choosing his son over his granddaughter, Aemon's only child, Princess Rhaenys, which in turn would cause much political controversy for several key figures, the likes of Rhaenys herself, her husband Corlys Velaryon, and even Queen Alyssa, feeling Rhaenys was unfairly passed over simply due to her gender. Again, this is another one of the factors that will come directly to influence the Dance of the Dragons, and something we will circle back to later. Baelon, like his brother, was a very good Prince of Dragonstone, and a strong heir to the Iron Throne, having served his father as Hand of the King for years. He would likely have been a very good king if he had gotten a chance. Baelon, however, would die very suddenly in the year 101 AC. While hunting in the Kingswood, he complained of a stitch in his side that progressively worsened. He became bedridden with the pain until 5 days later, he died of a burst belly as his father sat with him. The loss of Baelon, like Aemon, was a huge loss for the realm as a whole, and reignited a succession dispute with divisions on who Jaehaerys' new heir should be, Baelon's eldest son, Viserys, or Aemon's only child, Princess Rhaenys. This time, however, even for Jaehaerys, there was no clear choice, which resulted in the calling of the Great Council of 101. Again, we will circle back to this element later. This is foolish, father. Rhaenys is to be married next year, and it should be a great occasion. She will want all of us there, including both you and mother. The Archmaesters call you the Conciliator. I have heard. It is time that you conciliated. Maegelle to Jaehaerys. Fire and Blood, The Long Reign. Jaehaerys and Alyssa. Maegelle Targaryen was born in 62 AC, and by all accounts was very close to her elder sister, Alyssa, and her younger sister, Daella, as children. As a girl, Maegelle was gentle, quiet, studious, and exceedingly intelligent, and was said to read from the seven-pointed star every night before she slept, and was always eager to take her vows. She was known for her compassion and her gift of healing. Thus, Maegelle was promised to the Faith of the Seven in 73 AC at the age of 10 as a novice, and eventually becoming a Septa. Queen Alyssa announced that this was in thanks for the mother blessing her with many children. Given from what we know of her as a child, this path in life certainly seemed to suit Maegelle, given what we know of her character. We don't really know how much of a role Jaehaerys played in the decision regarding her joining the faith, but it seems Alyssa was the main instigator. It is implied that both her mother and father saw her as a trusted advisor in regards to matters of the faith and general advice. Namely, they looked to Maegelle to help try and solve some issues with her younger sisters, Daella and Saera. Both times the king and queen fell out during the first and second quarrels. The first after the disappearance of Saera Targaryen, the second after Jaehaerys' choice of naming Baelon heir over Rhaenys. It was Maegelle who reconciled her parents. However, we don't know exactly how she did that. Maegelle would die in 96 AC, treating grayscale victims in Old Town. For the most part, it always seems Jaehaerys, even if it was not his idea, did do the right thing for his daughter by letting her join the faith. And it does seem he trusted her view as an advisor. So in Maegelle, we can't really fault Jaehaerys as a father, especially when it comes to her untimely death. Prince Vaegorn was unlike his elder brothers, as Night to Day, the writings of Archmaester Vaegorn, Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alyssa. Vaegorn Targaryen is a case where Jaehaerys acted right by his son in helping him find a path in life that fits him, while at the same time lightly pushed him too hard on the way to discovering that. Vaegorn was born in the year 63 AC, and from a very early age it was clear he was nothing like his elder brothers. He was dour, irritable, and had no interest in martial pursuits whatsoever. Furthermore, he was very blunt and serious, which sometimes manifested as him being unintentionally cruel, most of the time at least. He was not well liked at court, even by his siblings, and frankly he disliked them also. He had a deep-rooted superiority complex, given his bookish nature and intelligence, which was very clear to see in 73 AC, when one of Queen Alyssa's companions asked Vaegorn and Daella when they would be wed, as many at court expected them to. Vaegorn's very public reaction gave grave insult to Daella, insisting that she need to find a husband who wanted stupid children, as those were the only kind she would be able to birth. After this, Daella fled the hall in tears. Vaegorn's older sister, Alyssa, emptied a flagon of wine over her brother's head, which too did not impress him. Instead, Vaegorn simply told his sister that she had wasted Arbor gold before leaving to change his clothes. Following this incident, Jaehaerys and Alyssa agreed that they would need to find other spouses for Vaegorn and Daella. King Jaehaerys decreed that Vaegorn would benefit from spending less time in the library and asked his eldest son, Baelon, to train Vaegorn at arms. Baelon trained him for a year, during which time both were miserable. One day, Baelon brought their sister Alyssa, dressed in mail, into the yard as a challenger to Vaegorn. Still recalling the incident with the Arbor Gold, Alyssa laughed and mocked as she humiliated Vaegorn in the yard. As Princess Daella looked down from the castle, when he could take no more, Vaegorn threw down his sword and left the yard forever. The solution for the troubled Vaegorn would come in 78 AC, when he was 15 years of age. Jaehaerys and Alyssa asked Grand Maester Alyssa whether Vaegorn might be a maester. Although the maester firmly replied no, he did confess Vaegorn might have had what it takes to become an Archmaester. As such, 3 days later, Vaegorn was summoned to Jaehaerys' Solar, where he was told he would be taking a ship for Old Town within a fortnight. Although Vaegorn responded curtly to his father, Jaehaerys would later tell Queen Alyssa that he believed Vaegorn had almost smiled. Vaegorn in time would become a key advisor to his father on occasion, most notably during the succession crisis of 101 AC after the death of Baelon. His father offered Vaegorn the throne, which he quickly rejected, but he did suggest the calling of the Great Council of 101 AC to settle the matter of succession, which for good or ill set Westeros down the path of the history we know. Now it's clear that both Jaehaerys and Alyssa struggled with Vaegorn, given how different he was from the rest of their children, and there is an argument that can be made that Jaehaerys' punishments of Vaegorn, forcing him to train martial pursuits despite his hatred of it, was overly harsh. But then, given his behaviour towards his sister Daella was intentionally cruel, he needed to be punished. You could also argue trying to force the match between Vaegorn and Daella was short-sighted, given how very clear to see it was that Vaegorn had no interest in women at all, let alone his sister. Forcing this matter only made it worse. Allowing Vaegorn to become a maester was clearly the best thing for him. It seems it's a role he excelled in, with his father respecting him enough to ask for his advice in regards to the succession dispute of 101 AC. Now here is where we really start to see a shift in Jaehaerys' parenting style. If we section his children into two eras, his early reign and later, he clearly treated his children born in his early reign, Aemon, Baelon, Alyssa, Maegelle and Vaegorn, differently from his younger children born in his later reign. As we will see, he was a lot more involved with the lives and upbringing of his elder children, where it really does seem he was more distant with his younger children, which in turn may have resulted in many of their tragic fates. But then again, like a lot of these issues, it's not actually as straightforward as it seems on the surface. While he certainly would make some questionable decisions, there were many factors at play which were completely out of his control as well. Princess Daella, the next oldest, was delicate and shy, easily frightened and quick to cry. The writings of Archmaester Vaegorn, Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alyssa. Daella Targaryen was born in 64 AC, and for many fans is the first instance of some undeniable poor parenting by Jaehaerys on full display, specifically relating to his lack of patience and almost disinterest in his daughter, directly being a contributing factor in her untimely death, even if her death itself was not specifically anyone's fault. She was a very small girl, around 5'2". Everyone who met her judged her younger than she was in truth, and there was always a childish aspect to Daella. Her mother, Queen Alyssa, described her as a little flower. As she grew into maidenhood, she was undeniably pretty, enough to attract the attention of young lords. Daella was considered sweet, kind and gentle, with a tender and loving heart. However, she was also delicate, shy, and a tongue-tied girl who was easily frightened and quick to cry. She liked flowers, but was afraid of gardens, bees and cats. The princess was not clever. Although she could read, Daella could only do so haltingly and without full comprehension. She didn't even speak till she was almost 2 years of age. The mildest of scoldings would reduce Daella to tears. It's very clear that Daella was younger than her years, both physically and mentally, and while she was kind-hearted, her fear and anxiety really caused huge issues for her interacting with the people of the court. In essence, she was not emotionally an adult. Thus, when it came time for her parents to find her a husband, it was always going to be a very difficult task. Like all of her daughters, it would initially be Alyssa who led the search and tried to help her daughter choose the right man, as despite her well-known delicate nature that would put off many suitors, she after all was a Targaryen princess, and it would still be a privilege for any great lord to marry her. The first attempt came when she was 13 in 77 AC. When she travelled to Driftmark to meet a young Corlys Velaryon, whom at the time seemed much more interested in his boats than Daella herself. The following year, she did briefly become friends with a group of young squires at court around her own age, but by the end of the year, after they attempted to get her drunk with wine, and one boy dared to kiss her, she hated them all. By 78 AC, it did seem like she finally had found a match in Royce Blackwood, the son of the Lord of Raventree Hall. As the betrothal was being planned, Daella found out the Blackwoods worshipped the old gods, and was horrified. Thus, the betrothal did not go ahead. It was in 80 AC that Jaehaerys lost his patience with Daella, and told his wife he wanted her married by the end of the year, and declared he no longer cared who she wed. Alyssa, concerned that Daella would not accept a husband, inquired what would happen to her if she failed in that deadline. as joining the faith was clearly not an option. In response, Jaehaerys proposed she joined the Silent Sisters, imploring Alyssa not to let it come to that. Alyssa explained all this to Daella and allowed her to choose between 3 men: Borman Baratheon, the Lord of Storm's End, Sir Tywin Lannister, the heir to Casterly Rock, and Roderick Arryn, the Lord of the Eyrie. Daella eventually chose Lord Roderick, declaring to Alyssa that he seemed good and wise like father. Concerning Roderick's 4 children and earlier marriage, Daella was pleased to be their new mother. According to Archmaester Vaegorn, Queen Alyssa's response to this was not recorded, but the account written by Grandmaster Alyssa about this day only said that Alyssa responded, "Gods be good." In 82 AC, after a year and a half of marriage, Daella wrote to her mother in her own hand to inform her of her pregnancy, telling Alyssa that she was frightened and asking her to come. Her mother flew her dragon Silverwing to the Eyrie, arriving 3 months before Daella was due. Alyssa remained with Daella until she gave birth, but Daella went into labour a fortnight too early and had a long and troubled time. Although her daughter, Aemma Arryn, was healthy, childbed fever soon hit after the birth. Her fever only grew worse, and Daella eventually died at the age of 18. It was generally accepted that her small stature and known frailness was a factor in her death. As we've discussed, many fans believe this is the first clear-cut case of Jaehaerys being a factor into the deaths of one of his children. From a certain point of view, this is correct, but it is more complex than it seems. Can we specifically lay any blame at Jaehaerys' feet for the tragic death of Daella during childbirth? Not really. As was the case with Alyssa, these things have an unfortunate high rate of occurrence in our setting. But what we can say is this: it's very clear that Daella, despite her age, was not emotionally or physically ready to be married. And while she did love her husband, Roderick Arryn, she was pushed down that path by her father's ultimatum. If she'd been given more time to both emotionally and physically develop as a person, she may have in time found a man of her own accord and have been more ready for a marriage, and all that entails. But we must also recall that this is the setting of Westeros. Alyssa had worked for nearly 5 years to find her a match, with the task seemingly impossible. Given her position, not just highborn but as a princess, Jaehaerys' insistence she marry can be understood somewhat. It's clear though that she was not a normal child, with most at court not understanding her, her father clearly included. So while in this case I don't think Jaehaerys was purposely neglectful, if he had known his daughter better, he may not have forced her down a path that ultimately led to her death. Such a fierce little thing she is. They say she has no need for comfort. They are wrong in that, I fear. All men need comfort. Bath on Saera Targaryen, Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alyssa. Saera Targaryen is, well, complicated. I've made a couple of videos about her and her life, and really find her a fascinating character. Her relationship with her father is also one of the ones fans argue about the most in terms of whether Jaehaerys was in the right with it, or frankly just an awful father. In fact, it's such a complex subject matter, it really does need a video on its own to analyse it properly, but I shall try and do the short version here. Saera was born in 67 AC, and from a very young age, she had been a willful and rebellious child who caused her Septas, siblings and parents, and the rest of court no end of trouble. She was said to be clever, witty, but also stubborn and bad-tempered when she did not receive the attention she craved. As she got older, her behaviour only became more extreme. In truth, it was difficult to resist Saera when she wanted to be charming. She quickly learned how to get anything she wanted from her father. However, she could not so easily manipulate her mother, Queen Alyssa. Although her eldest 2 brothers, Aemon and Baelon, were always amused by Saera's mischief, they never knew the worst of it, and according to Septa Maegelle, Saera's sisters all disliked her to various degrees. According to Grandmaester Alyssa, by the age of 2, Saera knew exactly what she wanted and when she wanted it. According to Bath, however, who observed Saera at the age of 12, Saera took it for her due that every need was seen to, and desired to in truth be the firstborn, or even the king's only child. As the 9th born, however, with 6 living siblings to contest with, Saera desired attention and comfort, yet would often find herself ignored in favour of her elder siblings. This all would come to a head when she was 15. Boys had always been a keen interest of Saera. She quickly had 3 favourites of all the men who attended her: Jonah Mooten, the heir to Maidenpool, Roy Connington, the Lord of Griffin's Roost, and Sir Baxton Beesbury, the heir to Honeyholt. Meanwhile, two girls her own age, Perry-Anne Moore and Alice Turnberry, became Sarah's closest friends. For more than a year, the three girls and young lordlings did everything together. At first, King Jaehaerys was pleased with this, as he considered all three of Sarah's male favourites promising when considering a future husband for her. Queen Alyssa did not agree, and spoke of her husband's doubts on Sarah's companions. Jaehaerys, though, waved the concerns away, claiming Sarah had never been alone with any of the men, as she was always attended by her servants, and thus could not possibly get herself into any trouble. But this would all blow up in 84 AC, when after a complicated series of events, involving the courtful Tom Turnip and a brothel, the true extent of Sarah's relationships with these men came to light. She had been sharing a bed with all three of the men, without the others knowing, as two were her two friends, Perry-Anne Moore and Alice Turnberry. After questioning, all three men and the two women admitted the truth of the matter. Only after questioning all parties involved did Jaehaerys call Sarah into the throne room, where at first he just scolded her for the joke involving the fool and the brothel. Alyssa then told Sarah that her friend Alice was pregnant, to which Sarah just made a joke. But when informed of the imprisonment of her three favourite lordlings, Sarah began to speak, and within the span of an hour went from denials to dismissals, quibbling to contrition, to accusations, to justification, to defiance, according to Septa Maegelle, who was present in the throne room. When Sarah finally fell silent, Jaehaerys asked her whether she had given her maidenhead to any of the three men, and Sarah proudly proclaimed that all three believed they had been the first, saying that boys were such silly fools. She declared she would be married, but that she could not decide which one of the three would be the best choice. When she suggested marrying all three of them, she compared herself to the likes of Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel. The latter comparison enraged King Jaehaerys, whom had her confined to her bedchamber. She had to be dragged there by guards. Most of the participants in this scandal were punished fairly. Baxton Beesbury, whom had been the one to first sleep with Sarah, chose trial by combat, where he was swiftly beaten by King Jaehaerys himself, as Sarah watched on. King Jaehaerys was furious and ashamed, and said more than once that Sarah was no longer his daughter. Alyssa, meanwhile, agreed that Sarah needed to be punished, and moved Jaehaerys by telling him that if he had been able to reconcile with the lords who had fought against his family and sided with Maegor, he could reconcile with Sarah as well. According to Septa Maegelle, Jaehaerys might very well have forgiven Sarah had she just done as she had been told. Instead, she escaped her confinement that night and attempted to enter the dragon pit, only to be caught by the dragon keepers. Enraged by this attempt of stealing a dragon, Jaehaerys had her confined to a tower cell. Eventually, Sarah was sent to Old Town and given to the Faith a fortnight later. At Old Town, her sister Septa Maegelle was to take charge of her instruction, and it was announced that Sarah would become a novice with the Silent Sisters. Septa Maegelle strongly believes that Jaehaerys only meant the sentence to be a lesson, that he felt a few years of silent prayer and harsh discipline and contemplation would be good for her and set her on the path to redemption, but that he did not intend for her to actually join the Faith in the end. However, Sarah did not care for this plan. For a year and a half, she endured life within the Faith, but in 85 AC, she fled from the mother house during the night, knocking down an older Silent Sister during her escape. Lord Hightower's men searched every house in Old Town, but they found no trace of her. When she did not turn up at the Red Keep either, Jaehaerys ordered her former friends to keep an eye out for her. Instead of hiding within the Seven Kingdoms, Sarah had found passage on a ship out of Old Town, which had brought her to Lys. There she took service at a pleasure garden, still clad as a novice of the Faith, pretending to be a god-sworn maiden for the patrons to despoil. The news reached court half a year after Sarah's escape from Old Town. Alyssa wept, saying the Lyseni had turned Sarah into a whore. Jaehaerys only proclaimed that she had always been one. After Sarah's apparent betrayal and abandonment, it is said that King Jaehaerys would never again be the same as he had been. He forbade Alyssa from keeping contact with Sarah, but Alyssa would defy him and hire agents to keep watch over her. Following the death of Sarah's three sisters, Alyssa, Daella and Viserra, within the span of 5 years, Alyssa begged her husband to bring Sarah home. Jaehaerys strongly refused to do so, declaring he did not want to hear her name again, and discouraged Alyssa from going to Lys herself. Alyssa would write to her daughter every now and then, although she never got a reply. Sarah became infamously wealthy, left Lys for Volantis a few years before 99 AC, In Volantis, she became the proprietor of a famous pleasure house. Like I said, we can make a whole video about the relationship between Saera and Jaehaerys, as this is only really the short version of events. First thing we have to consider here is Saera was the 9th born child and clearly desperately craved the attention of not just her father, but her whole family and court. Attention she had to work hard for, being the 9th born child. It does seem, prior to the scandal, Saera was able to get the attention from her father and manipulate him in a way she could not her mother. It does seem that by this time, Jaehaerys and Alyssa had both been a bit more lax in their parenting and didn't deal with Saera's behaviour in a more impactful manner before the scandal, which can clearly be seen by her excessive drinking from the age of 12. The warning signs were all there that something like this could happen, but they chose to assume that because her septors and maids had not seen anything, all was well. Now when it comes to the scandal itself and how Jaehaerys managed it, it's where fans start to criticise his actions. It is fair to suggest that Saera's attitude was intentionally confrontational, because in turn, that creates the drama and attention that she so badly craved. However, in this case, she overplayed her hand greatly. Was Jaehaerys' punishment too harsh? When you look at it in isolation, kind of, when you really break down the severity of what she did, there had to be some kind of consequence. While the initial scandal was her sleeping with her favourites, in truth, while this would have been an embarrassing scandal for Jaehaerys and House Targaryen, in the grand scheme of things, it's quite minor. While in this kind of society, Saera's perceived value as a match would have been lessened, she at the end of the day is still a Targaryen princess, with many lords still jumping at the chance to marry her. Just maybe the standard and level of lord had decreased somewhat, maybe from a great lord to a more minor one. When people debate this topic, they tend to focus on the sleeping around part, but in reality that isn't really the real issue that pushed Jaehaerys to the extent it did. It's her comparing herself to the likes of Maegelle the Cruel, a man who was a looming shadow over Jaehaerys' whole childhood, a man who killed his 2 brothers, the man who brutally ruled Westeros for a decade. It was a grave mistake for Saera to invoke him like that. The very man that was at the core of her father's trauma. The second was the attempt to steal a dragon. While stealing a dragon under any circumstances is risky and ill-advised, we have to recall the horrific fate of Aegon Targaryen, who once claimed Balerion the Black Dread without permission. A mistake that would cost her life in the most horrific way. While the story of Aegon Targaryen has been buried to the wider court, with only a handful of people knowing what happened, Jaehaerys and Alyssa were 2 of those people. So while Saera obviously didn't know the full extent of her actions in trying to steal a dragon, the level of punishment she received was in proportion to what she had done. I think the mistake was not making it clear to Saera that her time in the faith was only a temporary thing. If he had done this, she may have been more compliant and willing to listen. An argument I've seen put forward is that because Jaehaerys gave in to Saera so much as a child, with Saera apparently playing up to him to get what she wanted, in a way that Alyssa saw through, kinda set Saera up with this kind of behaviour in the sense that in the past she would simply be able to get away with it. If Jaehaerys had maybe heeded Alyssa's warning about Saera's nature and course-corrected her much sooner, there may have been enough time to course-correct and help Saera grow into a more well-adjusted young woman. I can kinda get behind this concept, but really there's only so much parents can do to set their children on the right path. Saera's ultimate fate is very much of her own free will. She chose to run away from Old Town Tallis to work in a pleasure garden. A short-sighted decision of a rebellious young woman, yes, but it seems a choice that she embraced and lived happily with. She ended up a wealthy and powerful woman in her own right. She became the queen of her own kingdom in a way, which is what she always wanted. I've made a video a few weeks ago arguing that Saera's fate may have been darker than Fire and Blood implies it is. That maybe she didn't go to Lys of her own free will, and working as a courtesan may not have been a willing choice either. I would suggest you go and check it out after this video, because it shows Saera's relationship with her family in a very different light. What a lot of fans point to as a criticism of Jaehaerys is his reaction to finding out his daughter was working in a pleasure garden. Not just his utter disownment, but the sheer vitriol behind it. He will not speak of her or allow others to speak of her. Even after his wife begged him to reconcile, he could never bring himself to do so. There are a couple of theories why. Maybe it's the shame of her actions, which is too much to face. Maybe it's the reality of his own failing as a father. Given the nature of Fire and Blood, we shall never know. But one thing I think is interesting is that on Jaehaerys' deathbed, as he became more senile, he frequently mistook a young Alicent Hightower, who was caring for him during this time, as his daughter Saera, which does suggest on some sort of level he still loved his daughter, and perhaps regretted his reluctance to reconcile. Jaehaerys certainly made many mistakes when it comes to Saera, not enough attention with her being the ninth born. Then when he did give her the attention she craved, he was easily manipulated and turned a blind eye to her negative behaviour despite warnings from his wife. There was time to correct and prevent her fate, but it never happened. By the time Jaehaerys did properly punish Saera, it was far too late, and her not being used to this kind of harsh treatment rebelled even harder, but ultimately resulted in Saera ending up in Lys. So in Saera's case, I do think Jaehaerys was a poor father, but not necessarily for the reasons you first think of when you read the story. One last point I want to make about Saera here is it seems likely she was heavily drinking from the age of 12. In Westeros, children her age do occasionally drink. The fact she was effectively an alcoholic at such a young age, and nothing was really done about it, does kind of point to no one really paying attention to her, and a real lack of parental guidance from the get-go. She has no interest in kissing games, nor boys. She plays with them as she used to play with her puppies, but she would no more lie with one than with a dog. She aims much higher after Saera. I've seen the way she preens and prances around Baelon. That's the husband she desires, and not for love of him. She wants to be queen. Alyssa Targaryen to Jaehaerys. Fire and blood, the long reign. Jaehaerys and Alyssa. Because of the huge scandal Saera Targaryen's fate was, and the sheer impact of Daella Targaryen's death would have on the future of Westeros, Jaehaerys and Alyssa's 10th born child Viserra is often completely forgotten about when discussing the concept of Jaehaerys as a father. Viserra was born in 71 AC and was said to be one of the most beautiful of Queen Alyssa's daughters. She had deep purple eyes and silver gold hair, flawless white skin and fine features. But at the same time, this inherent beauty meant that Saera was a vain girl. Once, when a young squire called her a goddess, she just simply agreed with him. The attention of the great lords, famous knights, and callow boys fed her vanity until it became a raging fire. Viserra delighted in playing one boy off against another, sending them on foolish quests or having them perform contests for her favour. She was a wild, high-spirited girl, but sly and had a grace that was uncanny and unsettling in someone as young as she was. According to Alyssa, always desired to become queen, and therefore had aimed to marry her brother, Baelon, not for love, but for ambition. Baelon had been a widower since the death of his sister, Alyssa, 2 years earlier. Viserra saw no reason as to why she could not wed her older brother. Queen Alyssa, however, was determined to prevent such a marriage, and betrothed the 15-year-old Viserra in 86 AC to Theomore Manderly, Lord of White Harbour. Viserra was not exactly excited about this marriage, as Theomore had grown very stout during his life and had been widowed 4 times already. Viserra first turned to her father for help, but Jaehaerys had agreed with the match and refused to interfere. She then turned to Baelon, hoping for him to rescue her. According to court gossip, she slipped past Baelon's guards and climbed naked into his bed, but Baelon sent the drunk girl away when he arrived in his chamber. In 87 AC, not long after this incident with Baelon, as arrangements were being made for Viserra's departure to White Harbour, Viserra traded her clothes with one of her maids and escaped her guards. She slipped from the Red Keep for one last night of laughter with her companions, 2 minor lordlings, and 4 knights. Near midnight, the princess and her remaining companions raced back to the Red Keep. At the foot of Aegon's high hill, Viserra's palfrey collided with the mare of another one of her companions. She was thrown from her saddle into a wall and died of a broken neck at the age of 15. On one hand, the death of Viserra can be seen as a tragic accident, but arguments could easily be made that both Jaehaerys and Alyssa really took their eye off the ball in terms of her behaviour, something which isn't exactly surprising, given after all she was their 10th born child. Even the most loving parents would find it hard to divide their attention equally between that many children, a task even more difficult when you are a king. Viserra took after her sister, Saera, in a lot of ways, and seemed to be on a similar path as her. But the key difference is her parents seemed to have a little bit more of a grip on her as a younger child, meaning she had fewer character flaws that were present in her sister. However, I think this is very much a case where Alyssa may have been the poorer parent rather than Jaehaerys. Alyssa was a big matchmaker. She loved to pair people up, and I think this was actually a really big problem in a lot of cases, such as the case of Daella, even though her hand was forced by Jaehaerys in this instance. She paired Viserra, a young 15-year-old girl with basically a fat old man in a place far from home and culturally very different from everything she knew. It was clear that Viserra did not want this to happen. She begged for it not to. The match generally was not a good fit for her. More so, if Jaehaerys and Alyssa were able to give Daella 5 years to find a husband, they could have also given Viserra the same kind of treatment. I think given time, a better match could have been found for her, but the match was pushed through despite all this. What we must recall, however, is by 87 AC, the scandal with Saera had already happened. Jaehaerys and Alyssa may have acted so quickly in finding a match, given they were concerned that Viserra might fall into the same set of behaviours as her elder sister. She was certainly sharing some similar personality traits to Saera at this stage. Marrying her off quickly in her parents' eyes may have been them trying to protect her from the same fate. But forcing this match with someone so unsuited to Viserra was never going to work out well, and would only push her to more extreme forms of rebellion, which is exactly what she did. Viserra snuck out of the castle for a last night in the wine sinks of King's Landing, only to die from falling from her horse in this drunken state. I would argue forcing the marriage through was a key reason for this, and I think Alyssa knew this and felt like this as well, hence how badly she reacted to Viserra's death. "I am 42 years old," she told the king. "You must be content with the children I have given you. I am more suited to be a grandmother than a mother now, I fear." Alyssa Targaryen to Jaehaerys. Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alyssa. Aemon Targaryen was born in 73 AC and would be Jaehaerys and Alyssa's 11th child. However, he was born too early and his birth was long and difficult and took its toll on Alyssa. Aemon would die at 3 months old. Aemon was followed with Jaehaerys and Alyssa's 12th child, another son they called Valerian, born in 77 AC. He was born after another troubled labour that left his mother, Queen Alyssa, bedridden for half a year. He was small at birth, similar to his elder brother Aemon. The sickly babe was attended by half a dozen nurses, however died the following year, a fortnight before his first birthday. The next year, the Grandmaester informed Queen Alyssa that she was once more with child, to her surprise and dismay. The writings of Archmaester Vaegorn on Gael Targaryen, Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alyssa. Their final and 13th child was a daughter they named Gael, born in the year 80 AC. As a babe, Gael was small and pale. She grew to be a shy and sweet girl, although simple-minded and frail. 80 AC was a winter year, giving her the sobriquet, the Winter Child. According to some, the name was given because Queen Alyssa was in her winter years of childbearing, at 44 years old at the time of her daughter's birth. Gael was cared for by Grandmaester Alyssa personally, as well as a Septa called Lyra, who nursed her through her first year. Given her size and the fate of her brothers, Aemon and Valerian, Alyssa could not emotionally stand to lose another babe, so much care was taken to protect Gael. After her sisters, Alyssa, Daella and Viserra had died within the span of 5 years between 82 and 87 AC, Gael became a comfort for her mother, along with her elder sister, Maegelle. Gael became Alyssa's constant shadow, and even slept in her bed. In 99 AC, Gael disappeared from court. It was announced that she had died of a summer fever, but after the deaths of King Jaehaerys and Queen Alyssa, it was revealed that Gael had been seduced and impregnated by a travelling singer. Gael had given birth to a stillborn son, and overwhelmed by grief, she had walked into Blackwater Bay and drowned. According to some, Queen Alyssa never emotionally recovered from losing Gael. Following her death, she could no longer stand to be in King's Landing at the Red Keep. Alyssa herself would die on Dragonstone less than a year after Gael in 100 AC. Given how little information we have about Gael, it's hard to really assess if there's anything different Jaehaerys and Alyssa could have done to save their daughter. One suggestion I have seen is that Gael may have been overprotected by her parents, given the deaths of her siblings. In turn, as Gael became a young woman, she may have had a rather simple and naive view of the world, with her being easily manipulated by, say, a travelling singer. The death of Gael, despite how little we know of her, I think is one of the sadder premature deaths, given how kind-hearted she's described as, and the sheer impact her loss had on her mother. It's tricky, because while we can pinpoint her being overprotected, and thus not well adjusted to the realities of the world, within the context of the situation, and the deaths of so many of her siblings, I can sympathise as to why her parents did try her best to protect her. It must be said that having 13 children, especially in a setting like Westeros, is a huge number. Over 29 years, Alyssa would give birth 13 times. Some have argued that Jaehaerys having this many children was unreasonable in itself, given the sheer mental and physical toll it left on his wife, and as we have discussed, it's impossible to equally give each of these children the same amount of time and attention they need to grow into well-adjusted adults. But this concept of Jaehaerys having too many children is a subject for another video. To address the main question in this video, was Jaehaerys Targaryen an awful father like many fans insist? Well, it sort of depends how you look at it. Out of 13 of his children, 10 died prematurely, at what I would call a very young age. Out of those 10, I think it's fair to discount Aegon, Daenerys, Aemon, and Velaryon, given that they died as babes or young children, thanks to either premature births or illness. Not really something we can blame Jaehaerys for. That leaves 6 of his children who died as teenagers or adults. I first want to speak of Alyssa and Daella. Both died during childbirth, but the circumstances were kind of different in each case. While Alyssa's death was tragic, she was 24 years of age, and a well-developed adult in a happy marriage, giving birth to her 3rd child, whereas Daella was forced to marry when frankly she wasn't physically, mentally or emotionally ready, despite the warnings from his wife regarding the matter. All this certainly did factor into her traumatic time giving birth, and thus her death as well. Aemon's death on Tarth could be counted as an unfortunate accident, with very little to do with how Jaehaerys parented him. You can make a bit of an argument that Jaehaerys should have taught Aemon a bit more humility, that while he was a dragon rider, he was still a mortal man, and walking about a war zone so freely was always a bad idea. But again, that's a bit of a stretch in my opinion. There is then Baelon, where again, while tragic, Jaehaerys could not exactly have prevented Baelon's death in any way. I do think that both Jaehaerys and Alyssa bear some responsibility in regard to Viserra's death. They both forced the marriage to a man not suited to her, despite the fact they allowed Daella to take 5 years to find her own husband. The context of the scandal of Saera Targaryen has on their rush to marry Viserra does explain their actions somewhat, but it's hard to look past their double standard and lack of care in choosing a match. When it comes to Gael's death, given how little we know of her, it's really hard to make a judgment if Jaehaerys as a father really had any impact. I don't even think we have any record of him interacting with her at all in Fire and Blood. You could argue Alyssa's overprotection could have played a role, but we can't say how much of that was also down to Jaehaerys. So out of the 10 deaths, I do think you can argue that Jaehaerys' parenting played a role in at least 2 of them, Daella and Viserra. I think when a lot of people question Jaehaerys as a father, they are mostly thinking of the scandal of Saera Targaryen, and what they view as unwarranted harsh treatment of her in the wake of it. It's complicated. Some have argued that from the get-go, we are told she's effectively an alcoholic at the age of 12, which was never really addressed, and shows a huge lack of parental guidance and responsibility. That's if anyone even noticed this at all. So it seems from early on, from a parental level, the eye was off the ball, which is not surprising when she is your 9th child. When you look at where Saera ended up, you can argue that her fate was harsh, considering the scale of her apparent crime. But when you look at the situation without the detailed context of exactly what happened, it's easy to make the assumption Jaehaerys basically exiled Saera to Lys to become a prostitute. But when you look at what his actual punishment was for her actions, sending her to live with Maegelle and the threat of going into the faith, it does kind of seem a more proportionate one to her apparent crimes. What happened after she was in Old Town was effectively Saera's own choice. I do think it was a massive misstep that she wasn't told Jaehaerys didn't intend for her to permanently join the faith, as that may have prevented her extreme course of actions to run away to Lys. We must also consider that Jaehaerys wasn't just punishing her for sleeping with her favourites, but also her general attitude to the matter. The attempt to steal a dragon, and comparing herself to the likes of Maegelle the Cruel, which in itself is a really dumb thing to do, especially when your father's Jaehaerys Targaryen. The issue with Saera is she was always, by nature, rebellious and anti-authority. So even if this specific incident didn't lead her to Lys, I think it was inevitable that something similar would happen eventually. I do think Jaehaerys is cold, and as some like to say, heartless reaction to finding out his daughter was a prostitute in Lys is worth mentioning as well. Basically disowning your daughter and claiming she was always a whore is, well, eyebrow-raising parenting for sure. I think it's clear that regardless of all this, Jaehaerys did still love his daughter, with her seemingly being close on his mind before his death. The issue is with Saera Targaryen's scandal is there's definitely some fault at Jaehaerys' feet, and some huge missteps taken with how the whole situation was handled. But Saera was always a free and independent woman. She ultimately chose her own path, and became a powerful and wealthy woman in her own right. I think it was always in Saera's nature to forge her own destiny, and she would have found herself living an independent life, regardless of her parents. She always knew what she wanted, and she would have worked to get herself there. This whole Saera situation is very complex, so at some point it will all have to go down in a video of its own, in much more detail. Jaehaerys did of course seemingly love all of his children. I don't think that can be argued, and there are many cases where he did right by them. Gael and Vaegorn are clearly examples. But there was also marrying Baelon and Alyssa among many others. The thing is, the negative elements of Jaehaerys as a father seem to jump out at the page more than the positive, because a lot of the positive stuff doesn't really make good history, the same way Saera Targaryen, or Viserra's death, or the sheer impact of marrying Daella too early. When Fire and Blood and the main books push this narrative of Jaehaerys being this chosen perfect king every other king is compared to next to Aegon the Conqueror himself, when there is negative things about him, they of course stand out more in the history books. They really jump off the page so much more due to how it contradicts the narrative of the perfect king. One thing I will maintain is there is clearly a huge divide between how he treated his older children versus his younger. He seemed to be much more actively involved with his elder 6 children, and more distant with his younger 7, which may have resulted in why his children chose the paths they did. Was Jaehaerys a bad father? Yes and no. It depends on the child in question. There's definitely some, in particular Daella and Viserra, where he definitely made huge missteps and directly contributed to their deaths. In Saera's case, I think you could argue he failed her. You cannot ignore the fact that between Daella, Saera, Viserra, and later Gael, he seemingly struggled to parent his teenage daughters. It's not exactly a normal thing 3 of his daughters would die as teenagers, and Saera at the age of 17 ran away to work as a courtesan in Lys. While he can't be held responsible for the entirety of many of these incidents, when you take a step back, look at it in that light, it certainly does leave a huge black mark on his legacy that Fire and Blood does a good job at framing as something minor. So when you look at it in the macro, then yeah, it does start to look like he's a bad father. But when you zoom in on each individual case, it's definitely not as straightforward. There are definitely some cases where Jaehaerys is at fault, some others where his role in it was very minor. But the reality of the question is different people have different views on it depending on how you personally interpret Fire and Blood, which is kind of why I love the book so much. My view and take on it can be utterly different to yours. So when you ask me if Jaehaerys was a good father, I will answer with this. What child are we talking about?